One of the things you said, it was actually a few Muslims, crazy Muslims, I think, who sort of flew the plane into those buildings. But was Hitler a Muslim by any chance? Because I'm not sure that Muslims had anything to do with the Holocaust.
Okay.
You talked about how Europe has dealt with this problem, and what you basically have alluded to in the 6 minutes that you had are that Muslims are a problem. And you're from the organisation called the Centre for Social Cohesion, and it's worrying that to have you talk about these things in this manner.
Tariq says that Europeans associate Islam with violence. There is some truth in that. There is also a very obvious reason for that, which is that Islam is associated with violence.
Douglas Murray, in this heated debate, proposed ways to resolve the complex and multifaceted conflict between Islamic and Western values in Europe. He pointed out that their approaches to integration are fundamentally different. Westerners seeking successful integration must demand mutual respect and understanding, requiring both the host society and the Muslim community to engage in open dialogue. Conversely, Islamic values emphasize policies that encourage integration by focusing on education, employment opportunities, and social services to help immigrants adapt while still maintaining their cultural identity. In addition, issues related to culture, freedom of speech, respect, tolerance, and legal policies remain persistent challenges that need to be addressed between Islamic and Western values.
Tariq says that Europeans associate Islam with violence. There is some truth in that. There is also a very obvious reason for that, which is that Islam is associated with violence. It was not Buddhists who flew planes into the Twin Towers. It was not Hindus or Jews that blew up the London Underground and buses a few years ago. And that simple fact has to be acknowledged if you're even going to start a dialogue. Now, what is happening, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a pantomime. I'd argue that Europe has done not too badly, considering the circumstances. In the middle of the last century, there was an almost negligible Muslim presence in Europe. At the turn of the 21st, in Western Europe alone, there were 15 to 17 million Muslims. That's a very fast migration, ladies and gentlemen, one of the fastest in human history. And no society would find it easy to deal with that kind of migration. As it happens, European societies, Western European societies have, I think, dealt with this much better than some would. Certainly, Muslims coming to live in Britain and in Western Europe enjoy more rights and better rights, among them freedom of worship, than they do in any Islamic country in the earth here today. We do have a problem. We have a problem when the failures of Islam throughout the world, the failures of all Islamic societies, come here into Britain. Their intolerance of freedom of conscience, their intolerance of apostates, their intolerance of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, their intolerance of minorities, other religious minorities, sexual minorities, their intolerance of gays, their dislike and distrust of half of the population, women, and many, many other things. And the call, what's more, for a parallel legal system within Britain and European societies.
Douglas Murray emphasized that Islam is associated with violence, suggesting that the failures of Muslim society, including intolerance and violence, are being introduced into Britain. He cited examples such as 9/11 and the London bombings to support his argument. Murray stated that Europe must resolve the conflict between Islamic and Western values to ensure social cohesion and stability. He emphasized the need for a strong stance on integration, where both Western society and the Muslim community engage in open dialogue and mutual respect, while upholding Western values such as freedom of speech and secularism.
I don't think it's the Muslims of Europe that have failed. The Muslims of Europe that have failed Europe. I think it's exactly the opposite. One of the things you said, it was actually a few Muslims, crazy Muslims, I think, who sort of flew the plane into those buildings. But was Hitler a Muslim by any chance? Because I'm not sure that Muslims had anything to do with the Holocaust.
Okay. Gentleman there.
In 2009, the Centre for Muslim Studies, along with the Gallup poll, interviewed 500 British Muslims. Over 99.5% of those British Muslims found homosexual acts unacceptable. What was interesting is that the government has given concession to Muslims as well as other religious organisations. So it seems to me, in fact, this government here is prepared to give religious organisations, including Muslims, the rights over lots of gay men and women.
third.
You talked about how Europe has dealt with this problem, and what you basically have alluded to in the 6 minutes that you had are that Muslims are a problem. And you're from the organisation called the Centre for Social Cohesion, and it's worrying that to have you talk about these things in this manner. What you are basically alluding to is that Muslims are external to Europe, and it's worrying that you see it that way, because then that means there is no chance of there being any solution to any problem, or Muslims being seen as a part of Europe and being seen as European citizens. Thank you.
Gentleman there.
I just want to pick up something that Douglas Murray said. I'd like to ask you, when you talk about the Muslims that are the problem, which Muslims are you talking about? Because you keep slipping in your language to focus on the radicals, the extremists.
Okay, right.
Maybe that's because that's what you're interested in. But there's another whole set of Muslims out there who are not like that.
Okay, just a quick clutch there. Yeah.
It is sufficient to point out that Europe is not failing its Muslims, that this debate is taking place tonight and is being televised by the BBC World Service, that Tariq Ramadan holds a chair at Oxford University. I put it to you because of these very facts, that you are being welcomed, that you are being integrated, that you are being respected. You are not a problem.
It can be seen that the treatment of Europeans in general, and Douglas Murray in particular, towards Muslims is being fiercely debated. Douglas Murray has argued that Europe has not failed its Muslims, and that they are being welcomed, integrated, and respected. Audience members at the debate countered by saying that the treatment of Muslims in Europe is the real problem. They reflected on the government's support for religious organizations and Muslims, and argued that Murray's position implied that Muslims were being considered outsiders in Europe, which would hinder their integration.
Well, first of all, just to pick up on a couple of people, particularly women, who've said about the terrific things that Islam gives women in terms of rights. The first thing is, yes, in 7th century Arabia, some of this was progressive. In 21st century Britain, it is not. And you have to make that fundamental admission that the Quran is not a document for women's rights in Europe in 2010. It is not. Secondly, why is it that only Islamic societies and mosques in this country are places which teach and preach hatred of other minorities? Every single week in this country, there are people on campuses who teach the murder of minorities. Last week, it was somebody who calls for the murder of apostates. The week before, at another university, it was somebody who believes the Jews are fair game. This is not tolerable. It is not tolerable for Muslims. It is not tolerable from anyone else. You, I hope, would agree with me that any minority that engaged in such hatred and bigotry should be criticized. Don't pretend that the cloak of Islam and Islamic belief and religious fervor means that people like us cannot say that people who call for the murder of minorities are not mainstream, are not acceptable, and have to be critiqued.
Douglas Murray argues that although some Islamic teachings were progressive for women's rights in 7th century Arabia, they are inappropriate for 21st century Britain. He asserts that the Quran does not play a role as a document protecting women's rights in contemporary Europe. At the same time, Murray also questioned why it was only Muslim societies and mosques in Britain that regularly taught and preached hatred towards other minority groups. He emphasized that every week in the country there are individuals on campuses who advocate the minorities. For example, one week someone called for apostates to be killed, and last week someone at another university declared that Jews were fair game. He emphasized that this is intolerable for Muslims or anyone in this world, for both Muslims and non-Muslims. Any minority group that engages in such hatred and bigotry must be criticized, and religious fervor should not shield those who call for violence from criticism. He calls for a clear stance against these harmful ideologies, regardless of the religious context in which they are presented.
For a parallel legal system within Britain and European societies. This is monstrous. No other group behaves like this, asks for parallel laws. This is a fundamental problem, and it's one we're going to have to deal with. It's a problem between a society, Western Europe, that believes that laws are based on reason, and Islam that believes that they are based on revelation. Between these two ideas, I'm not sure there is very much compromise for Europe. It is not Europe that has let down its Muslims, but the Muslims of Europe that have let down Europe. This is not solely something which we have to say we can never reconcile. Of course we can reconcile this, but we need to be honest about it. We need to be frank about it, and we cannot avoid things just because they are unpleasant. And if there were one thing I would wish Muslims in Europe could learn today, as fast as possible, it would be this: that you have no right in this society not to be offended. You have no right to say that because you don't like something you can commit violence, or you would like something to be stopped or censored. You have no right to have more hate laws or hate crime laws or hate speech laws just to defend Islam. You have to realize, the Muslims of Europe have to realize, that a society in which even your deepest feelings can be trodden upon is the only society worth living in. And the sooner we can learn that, the sooner that Islam can learn that within Europe, the better. It is not Europe that has failed its Muslims. It is Islam that has failed Europe. I'd argue Islam has failed its Muslims. Thank you.
Douglas Murray argues that European societies face a fundamental problem with some Muslim communities, particularly regarding their demand for parallel laws. He emphasizes that this issue stems from a clash between Western Europe's belief in laws based on reason and Islam's belief in laws based on revelation. Murray suggests that there is little room for compromise between these two ideas. He contends that it is not Europe that has let down its Muslims, but rather the Muslims of Europe who have let down Europe. Despite this, Murray believes reconciliation is possible, but it requires honesty and frankness. He stresses that avoiding unpleasant truths is not a solution. Murray calls for Muslims in Europe to understand that they have no right to be free from offense in this society. He argues that committing violence or demanding censorship because of personal offense is unacceptable. Additionally, he asserts that Muslims should not seek more hate crime or hate speech laws solely to protect their feelings. He concludes that a society where even deeply held beliefs can be challenged is the only society worth living in. Murray believes that the sooner Islam in Europe learns this principle, the better. He reiterates that it is not Europe that has failed its Muslims, but Islam that has failed Europe, and ultimately Islam that has failed its own adherents. Douglas Murray condemns the teaching of hatred in Islamic societies and mosques, asserting that such intolerance is unacceptable and should be criticized to promote better social cohesion.